Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Testing Peers. Today we have a very special episode with some very special guests, but I'll introduce one of our regulars first and foremost. Hello, David.
Hello.
And joining us today, we've got Dermot.
Hello.
We've got Beren.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about the topic of risk appetite. Before we dive into there and into our usual banter, we've got a message from our sponsors, kindly read even, by Beren.
Saffron QA continue to be our sponsor, and they are also here to support the testing community. Therefore, should any of our listeners be in the market for a new job in testing or hiring new talent for your team, please reach out to Ben. He can be contacted via email at ben@saffronqa.co.uk.
And now over to Dermot to challenge us with his banter skills.
I don't know about banter skills, but I have a question that I want to throw into the mix. So among all of you, what have you seen recently? A film or a TV series? Ideally a film, something that you commit to that you actually enjoyed. I've had a couple of recent experiences, just decided to up my game in terms of cinema going recently. So I'm just curious to know what you have committed to and whether it paid dividends in the long run.
About a year ago, I started learning German, and one of the best ways to learn German is by watching TV in German. And there's a really good TV series called Dark, which is completely spoken in German, and the subtitles and everything is awesome, except it is extremely complex. So learning the new language and having an extremely complex TV series was not perfect. So I decided to go down in the level of German and TV, and I completely watched Too Hot to Handle Germany. And even though it wasn't the best type of films or TV, I did get the German. I did learn a bit.
You were right. Immersion obviously is the best way to learn any language. But yeah, Dark, having watched it, I mean, there are entire posters of mapping out the paths of each of the individual characters just so that you can actually keep track of what's going on because it's that complex. And then having to put like German syntax and German grammar on top of that. You need another poster for that.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, David?
So I've got two, actually. So one is a sort of a fun one. I watched it a couple of days ago, streaming The Lost City, which has got Sandra Bullock, which actually I sort of thought it was better than I expected. Let's put it that way. And actually, so I did quite enjoy it. And then last night I went to see Oppenheimer, which is a fantastic film. It isn't the sort of film you come out feeling happy from. It's very thought-provoking. It's really interesting how humans treat each other, not just obviously the story, but actually as characters themselves. So enjoyment, no, but fantastic film, very good. Yeah.
How about you, Russell?
I am struggling to think of any film I've watched at all, ever, at this moment in time. My brain has gone completely blank.
Dermot, what about you?
So recently I went to see the new Indiana Jones film, and also the new Mission Impossible film. I ended up going to see the Mission Impossible film twice because there's a lot going on. But they each held the potential for massive failure in terms of meeting expectations. But I'm happy to say, for me anyway, that they excelled. They didn't disappoint.
And it's interesting you saw Mission Impossible twice, because obviously it's only the first part, so you can just watch the second part twice as well.
Oh yeah, you'd have to balance that out somehow, you know.
Makes sense. For me, not really much comes to mind. I'm not really watching much at the moment on TV. But I guess the thing, I'll go for a non-movie, go to Blacklist, TV series. So it's just kicked off again. It's all about kind of the FBI most wanted person actually working with the FBI to capture the criminals. My dog is named after a character in it, Dembe.
So would you say that you committed a certain amount of time?
I've watched
And
6 series of it. That's a lot of time.
yeah, but then there was a risk that wouldn't pay off.
Yeah, and there's been times where I wish I'd stopped watching it because it did get bad. It went to during the pandemic. It went to cartoon style. Briefly, like scenes of it were just made into kind of cartoon sketch type things, just because they couldn't actually film it. They wanted to finish the series.
That's crafty.
Yeah, it was some abstract thinking to get things done.
Did it actually work? Having that?
It completed the series. That's the best way I can describe it. So it didn't leave you hanging, but I think there was wider problems than actually just the way in which they did it. It was interesting. And it's a good solution to the fact that you couldn't get together to do anything. So I quite liked it. It's certainly better than kind of some of the other methods or just waiting. At least I like that they were pragmatic.
Absolutely.
Anyway, should we go and talk a little bit about risk appetite? Beren, do you want to describe a little bit about what you were telling us a bit earlier?
Definitely. So the people that know me a bit, they know that my past 5 years, I've traveled most of Europe, giving more than, let's say, 100 workshops on risk analysis and risk management. It's called risk storming. There's an online tool, there is a card deck, there is a board game, it's a workshop, and it's all about risk management and getting the voices of people in your team that care about quality and risks and value, getting it together, coming up with a plan, and figuring out, okay, how are we going to deal with all these risks? The idea behind the whole workshop is that before Agile, we did a lot of risk management. There were risk managers who did a crazy amount of activities, lots of processes, lots of documentation. And with the coming of Agile, I feel that was thrown out of the window together with a lot of other things that were maybe a bit too rigid. But risk management and risk analysis is still a very important activity. And we're not doing that as much as I would hope that we would do this. And even after giving all these workshops and talking to all these people, I still now hear halfway in 2023 people being frustrated that the discussion about risks is not happening enough. So I'm wondering why? Where are we in the testing craft and the quality craft if we're still struggling to talk about risks, to get buy-in from people to talk about risks and dealing with risks? Are we using the wrong words? Are we coming up with the wrong arguments? I'd love to check with the peers and see what your ideas are.
I guess I'll start us off because I often talk about testing being pretty much a risk management process. Kind of one of my expressions about testing, describing it. So I don't think you can have a conversation about testing without talking about risk, because we're testing risks. We're trying to mitigate risk in the action that we're doing. I think it's maybe the changes in the language, rather than, because as you said, the people that owned risk management have faded away a little bit, and it's delivery managers now, and it's project risk versus kind of like delivery risk versus kind of the solution risk. That's generally what they manage. They trust the engineering teams to go and engineer rather than actually managing that risk. So they've just, in effect, they manage the delivery risk and they don't focus so much on the other risks. They let the experts or supposed experts manage and talk about the risk, and it's become hidden versus visible, and it's under the scenes, and we're not framing things in a risk-based way, as in there's a story I need to test. I'll test it. Well, when I figure out what I'm testing, I'm looking at the risks, assessing them. Is it boundaries? Is it something else? And is it performance? What's the characteristics I need to think about? And I do it like that. I think it's just become a hidden activity rather than necessarily an upfront activity. And it's lost its space or lost its kind of wider. I'm trying to think, it's not ownership I'm thinking about. It's kind of its wider visibility. It's kind of, as I said, it's kind of hidden in the other work. It's kind of my view on it.
Yeah, I think it's. I'm trying to think back. The last time I actively engaged in a risk process was in a project that was kind of hybrid waterfall and agile. Like it was agile internally and waterfall externally. So we had the waterfall processes up to the point that our portion began, and then we were trying to follow safe principles. But prior to that, we had to work out our risk matrix and risk assessments. But as you say, Russell, it's sort of become like there's an understanding that it's supposed to be implicit, but we never talk about it. And in my experience, if something is implicit and never spoken about, it doesn't happen.
Or it's lucky if it happens.
Yeah. But, hope isn't a strategy.
It's a common one, sadly. It's not a good strategy.
I agree that I think it is a sort of a hidden thing. In terms of risk storming, the last risk storming I did probably was before COVID, but I'm very much aware that I need to include that. The difficulty for me is the sort of hybrid working, having some people in the office and some people not. And I know that there is an online version. We haven't actually used that, but I am aware, because the department is aware of risk storming, I am going to run some workshops in order to enlighten all the rest of the group in order to understand exactly what risk storming is. And the times that I've used risk storming is that, irrespective of whether it's waterfall or agile, it's good to get the clients or the customers or whoever's, what is you can find out their appetite for risk, and you can also find out what actually is important to them going on in the project. So therefore you can highlight that, irrespective of it being agile. If you know what their highest risks are, then you can add value by concentrating on that in whatever you do. Because without that knowledge, you're assuming that there is risk there. There is risk there, but actually our own appetite for risk might be very different to the clients or the customers that we're actually doing. And so therefore we need to find out what their appetite for risk is and what their high risk areas are, so that therefore we can gauge our testing, our project, our design based on that. And without that risk storming, or however you do your risks, then actually you're almost setting yourself up for failure. So it should be something that should be discussed. I don't think it is enough, but people don't fit it. Unless it happens to them, they don't necessarily think the importance is there, because it until it happens, they're ignorant.
So if we would attribute a percentage of, let's say, testing teams, or out of all the testing teams, how big of a percentage does do risk management or risk analysis, whether it's risk storming or something else? Doesn't really matter, but just some type of risk activities. Let's say if it's 50%, then following what you said, David, the other 50% who don't do it are actually not focusing on what's most important, what's valuable, what's risky. So their strategy or their activities are in danger of being absolutely futile. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And that just perplexes me. And having been in the industry for about 10 years now, I've been to many conferences, and in many conferences I hear, oh, we're not doing well enough with the testers, or we're not focusing on the right things, or we see massive layoffs, or like all these dramatic things, or all of the testers were replaced by automation or something, or that's the goal that our new boss has. Just when I hear all of these things, I think maybe if you go to the basis and do risk management and risk analysis and have this discussion and get buy-in, it's gonna go a very long way of making things better. But why is that so difficult?
Well, the bill always comes due, doesn't it? Somebody somewhere ends up paying for a lack of planning, in this case around the area of risk and mitigating risk. So somebody somewhere far down the line, long after they are able to do something about it, is saddled with doing something about it.
It's a bit like the whole shift left in testing. As part of the shift left is highlighting those risks up front. And so therefore, again, you can plan for it, you can mitigate them for them as much as you can. But if the further along through the process you think about them, they might already have happened. You might already have missed the boat on some of those. And so therefore you've built an unstable framework already that has built-in risks that are more likely to happen. And that's a really dangerous thing. But I think that you're quite right. It's cost time, and in certain things it's trying to get with the agile sort of framework and stuff, it's getting things out quickly, it's getting things out there used and stuff, and actually the risk to that is the fact that it may not necessarily be usable. It may not actually do what you want it to do. It may not have the impact that you want. So without the thought process before that, actually you're putting a lot of effort potentially into the wrong thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a huge risk of doing that, definitely. I was just thinking, because one of the things Agile has driven, and what I've seen from my experiences, this kind of concept that testers need to test for everything. So you need to do the accessibility, the availability, the adaptability, the cross-browserness. You need to test. Your list just actually, rather than being risk-based, everything's a risk, therefore test for everything. And the Agile tester has now got a responsibility and routine to cover all risks. And maybe, and this is a hypothetical, I guess, they've just stopped doing risk-based analysis and risk things, saying, well, whatever it is, I'm going to be responsible for it. So I'm going to plan for everything. I'm going to build into my pipeline some of these things. Security now I'm responsible for as well. Building the pipelines I'm responsible for. The data I'm responsible for, because of this DevOps and Agile all in it together, everything. So it's just become kind of messed up and confused, rather than thinking, well, actually, you may be responsible for everything, but doesn't mean everything is equal in risk. There might be 1,000 different risks, but that doesn't mean they're all equal, and still need to prioritize based upon the risk and impact what's most important, because in Agile, you still don't have infinite time. Otherwise, you'll be testing forever. So you've got to prioritize what you spend that on with the stakeholders and with the things. Certainly my teams, I've seen a tendency from business stakeholders to put requirements on the testing that there is 0 defects of accessibility, there is 0 security issues. And there has been certainly a recent trend to be less risk accepting. Brilliant reason for us, though, to get back into the risk game, to actually use it to advocate why this is crazy and why 0 risk is actually kind of an impossible feat. But at the moment, I'm certainly seeing a trend in the areas I've worked of late, where that drive is to, you can't release anything of this issue, which is odd, because I remember that trend years ago. It went. It became much more adaptable. Since COVID, it seems to kind of gone back again.
Yeah, the whole risk aversion thing, and things about certain industries, and in particular regulated industries, being risk averse. But I mean, 0 risk, as you say, is impossible. You can't advance unless you take a certain amount of risk. And that, there is a risk to any software project, which is that massive coronal ejection will wipe all the hard disks on the planet. It's a risk. I mean, it's a 1 in a million risk, but there's a hierarchy of risks that we can accommodate and plan for. And that would certainly be one of the lower ones. But yeah, if we do that work up front, then we're better placed for advancing in a software project.
I think the world would have a massive problem. So it's risk-based to everyone else with that corona injection. Because if the whole AWS died, I think most systems would be dead.
There were 2 things you said, Russell, that I would like to go into. One of them was that as quality coaches or testers or however we want to name ourselves, is that we're responsible for all aspects of quality. I think a part of that as well is that the whole team is responsible these days for every aspect of quality. So all of the aims or the goals are kind of muddled. feels like it can obviously be very confusing very quickly looking at all these things. And then another was to prioritize the work and the risks, because risks is work. For me, it's two sides of the same medal. So value and risk is the same thing, just one way of a different way of looking at it. And it's work. You bring value by building something or by doing something. You mitigate risks by doing something. So maybe another way of phrasing risks and so on is by talking about value. But in order to prioritize this work, we first need to get it out of the hidden space, what you mentioned earlier. So I think it's kind of easy to keep these things under the surface and do the work and never talk to anyone. And then when the risk actually manifests, say, oh, this is just inherent to software development. Things are going to happen and it's going to go wrong. Oh, sorry about this. We're going to fix it now. And maybe we've just gotten used to this type of behavior of applications just failing us. And then, this will just be a software issue. They will solve it soon.
The idea of safe to fail is certainly something that I hold very dear, but that in itself is based on, or should be based on, a risk assessment. Like, you have to plan for failure. You have to plan for an adequate way of failing and recovering. Otherwise, every failure is potentially a catastrophic failure, like a product ending failure or a company ending failure, potentially, unless you plan for it. And that is risk mitigation. So you put the measures in place in case it fails. But you have to identify the risk ahead of time. So just reacting and adapting, you do your best. Everyone does their best, obviously, but you can't rely in the moment that what you're going to be doing is the most strategic thing to compensate for the failure. And that's really where risk assessment and risk evaluation should come in, way at the start, as was mentioned earlier. Like, David, you mentioned about shifting left. That conversation should start at the very start. How can this fail? And I assume that everybody who wants the project to succeed doesn't want to admit that there will be a failure. And they also are averse to risk on the level that risk is perceived as negative. So there would have to be some sort of framing. And Beren, what you mentioned there about it being a value, not a risk as such, but like some sort of equation of value and work associated with the value that is merited, is maybe the way to approach it. But, I suppose it depends on each team and each organization. And going back to the risk appetite, is there an appetite to talk about risk in terms of risk and mitigation?
I completely agree. I think that risk does have a certain amount of value, especially at the end goal. What is most important to the clients, to the end users? What value does it have if something goes wrong at that thing? So actually mitigating those risks as early as possible. And I think that, testing is again reducing those risks. And as much as we can do up front by going, okay, we have a risk, anything you do, even your test strategy is highlighting those higher risk areas. Which are the things that are most likely to break in this? Which are those ideas or have we struggled with in implementing? So therefore, there is a risk in that area. So if you plan up front that actually this is a high risk area because it's difficult to do, it's challenging or whatever, then you can put more effort into that. Whereas actually, if you haven't highlighted that as a risk to the whole team, then that message may not actually get, especially if you haven't shifted left, you're doing that traditional thing of bringing the tester in late. That discussion of potentially of the risk happened early on, or that perceived risk, and it hasn't then permeated down to the people that may be coming into the project later on because it's grown into a larger project than first thought. It has to be understood early on and addressed or considered throughout the process to make sure that it's covered and everyone has a responsibility for those particular risks. Because if you haven't planned for it up front, then you're going to lose sight of it, and you have the possibility that it will slip into your product.
Right. So I think we all agree that risk management, risk analysis, right, whether it's risk storming or any other type of activity, is valuable. But is it practical?
Yes and no. It depends. Well, I'm going to link that question back to something I had as a thought, hopefully, and bring me back if I don't do this linking very well. DevOps, Dora. We've changed our risk management and how we release software. We're advertising kind of rapid change, failure recovery, those sorts of things. So it has changed our risk appetite. It has changed how we deem risk and what's important to us. Catastrophic failure is more the problem now versus a defect going in production in many cases. So not all systems are built like that. So we've changed the way in which our engineers think about the risk. It's the risk of, can I roll it back? Can I fix it forward? How fast is the change? So I think it's changed the way we look at the approach and how we manage it. And so to your point, risk is really, really important. But because of some of the directions, Agile was one of them, but back in the day, that started this off, I think, we've changed how we perceive risk and therefore manage risk, and acceptance of risk, and all these things have now changed. So the ground has shifted beneath our very feet, so that teams look at risk differently. So whether it's there's certain priorities. So imagine the risk storming deck of the kind of things to focus on. Almost that deck has changed. It's, the recoverability one is almost certainly much more important. The responding failure rates, things like that is much more important now than perhaps the usability or something like that, because you monitor that in production and use the production data to feed back into what you do. So it's less done in testing, more done in monitoring, observability, and so on. So we've shifted what risks are and how they're impacted. And I think we haven't necessarily shifted our heads to go alongside that in my head. So I don't think I stayed to your point. So sorry, Darren.
No worries. I absolutely agree. With Agile, releases are smaller, so that means risks are smaller. We go more frequent, which means the impact is smaller. We have more control in production, feature toggle, dog fooding, all these things. We have done so many innovation and new activities to mitigate risks already, but they evolve. With all these mitigations come extra risks and so on. So it's very interesting. Absolutely agree.
Yeah, there's a sort of combinatorial effect, and certainly, I suppose, we dodge a few bullets, metaphorical bullets, with process. And in fact, that's the whole reason those processes were developed in the first place. Like, first of all, there was the DevOps approach, which mitigated the risk of having to build environments meticulously by hand, which is unfortunately something I've had to do. So I appreciate the DevOps approach, and it mitigated the risk of human error. But then we started to realize that with DevOps, you had to, it was an ideal to implement your DevOps in code, which was managed. So you'd mitigate the risk of the code that you wrote for handling the DevOps risk being negatively impacted by poor version control. So with each iteration, this combinatorial effect builds up. So each new strategy brings its own risk.
I think also with the Agile approach, that the appetite for risk or calling out risk has decreased, because people don't want to put the time in for those small releases to think about those risks and the mitigation, because it's a repeating thing. For every sprint or whatever, however you do it, you have to think about those risks. And actually, is that valuable enough for that sprint to actually think of that? And so I do wonder whether the framing of it has changed, because people haven't got that hierarchical or top level understanding of what the risks are. And so therefore they lose sight of it and haven't got the capacity to filter it every time with those small incremental changes.
think the risk, though, is at the higher levels, if you see what I mean. It's gone to the strategy, which therefore maybe sometimes people in the teams don't feel they can influence as much. They're following a pattern, not influencing the patterns heavily. Like the pipeline for DevOps, for example, that's generally an enterprise level. It's quite common patterns. You might have some power over it, but actually you're following a good practice, shall we say, rather. So you've got less control. So the risk mitigation is done more often at enterprise level or at a DevOps level or pattern level. So you're at the story level or at minor parts of a project, you're just following the same things and iteratively doing things. Because it's a pattern, you're kind of losing some of the focused time to actually go, well, actually, is this right still? Like we retrospect heavily, certainly in Scrum and lots of other agile processes, but we don't think about risk. We generally think about what we did, our activities, our actions. We don't always bear in mind the outcomes. Sometimes we do, but again, it depends a little bit on how often we release, how often we get feedback. So often teams are getting, there's more autonomousness in the day-to-day, but less autonomy in the strategy to a degree. So I don't know, maybe it's just my worlds, but I'm seeing more of the pipelines driving the strategy versus actually the testers setting up what infrastructure they want and all that sort of stuff. It's more provided with DevOps concept of people working together. Your environments or infrastructure is code. You just repeat the code. You don't recreate it half the time. So you repeat the patterns, and there's risks in that as well. But because of it, we think it mitigates a lot of risks because we're evolving something rather than creating every time.
Which it does. It does mitigate a lot of risks. Today or yesterday, I read two things actually. One is we are in an industry of perpetual inexperience. So we always have an influx of new people who need to learn a lot of things anew. And that our software systems that we're building are the most complex things humankind has ever been building since the start. So those two things together, even though we have made a lot of innovation already to mitigate a lot of risks, these two things together, they generate a whole new level of risks as well. So I think we really should continue doing risk analysis. But coming back to the question I said earlier or proposed earlier, is it practical? How do we get the team? How do we get the decision makers, the clients, the people around us to also care?
And also, going back to what you were saying about sprints and setting up a sprint and planning a sprint and incorporating risk analysis into that sprint, if it takes as much time to work through your risk analysis as it does to do all the rest of the planning for the upcoming sprint, the appetite for doing that activity is going to be lessened. Whereas, if it can be done relatively quickly, if people come with their ideas and they kind of run through some sort of assessment matrix or some sort of assessment process or risk storming or whatever, if it doesn't take a huge amount of time, because I think everybody has meeting fatigue, and there is a risk of it with agile if you're not careful. But if you can approach it in such a way that it doesn't overburden or overcommit the people who are going to be actually doing the work, then it suddenly becomes practical, because you can involve people in that on a team level. You can also incorporate information or knowledge from outside as well. But yeah, like getting buy-in, obviously, like I've seen agile teams that ask for forgiveness rather than permission, and in which case getting buy-in from higher levels is not as much of an issue. But I suppose other organizations do want all levels to be aligned. Like the higher up design phase needs to be aligned with the actual implementation and so on. So on that level, how do we define practical across an entire organization?
Another way to think about it is, with that risk, is, as we've discussed, perhaps doing it at every sprint is not necessarily achievable or whatever, but but can you, at the beginning of a phase or a new part of it, consider those risks as part of that? You know, as Russell said right at the beginning, often we consider project risks rather than actually, or process risks rather than actually looking at the actual design and things like that, and actually considering those risks should be a major part and should be considered often, not and relatively frequently, but maybe not at every sprint, but actually regular retros, not even at every retro. You know, there needs to be an understanding. If everyone is in charge of quality as part of, you know, and development and everything, then everyone should have an understanding of what risks there are in each particular aspect of the phase of work or whatever they are doing. So yes, I think there should be. I don't think it needs to be as frequently as every sprint, but there needs to be an understanding of those risks and the mitigations associated with it.
So I was just thinking that we've changed the problem domain to a degree now with some of our approaches, that the way in which we do risk also needs to change. We've always done it in layers. Perhaps maybe it's time to make it part of a pipeline as well, if that makes any sense, that certain things are not going to change regularly, as we know. So the way in which a project's done, the stakeholders in it, what they want is generally going to be consistent. Your customer base doesn't radically change overnight. Now, it might change per a feature or for a big area, but it's unlikely to change for a tweak to a feature necessarily. But it can change, but there's different layers to it. But so is also kind of like how you deal with security. There's certain patterns of certain ways in which you do it. So there's certain layers of abstraction that you can place into risk management. And maybe this whole world where we've done sort of project, product, consumer-based risks or test risk and things like that, deployment risks, maybe that has changed a little bit, and we have to think of risk at a sprint level, at a project level, and maybe we have to do it at levels, or maybe the layers is no longer relevant because actually we need to review them every 6 months versus every sprint. And maybe the flow and loops have got to change because things aren't changing. We're tweaking small things in an iteration now. You know, gone are the days of 3 months worth of work going out in the release. Well, in most places. We're trying to do continuous delivery. We're making one change and literally get into production within minutes. The level of risk for that is very different for a monthly release of lots of changes over time. And applying a layered approach to that continuous delivery pipeline would stop work. You wouldn't get continuous delivery. But applying it to a 3-monthly release cycle logic works well. The weekly or fortnightly kind of release model kind of half works. It's good. But obviously, if you speed it up even faster, and that's, I think, most of us are trying to do, I think my view is 2 weekly releases now is not as good as it should be. Once upon a time, if you told me my team could do 2 weekly releases, I would be ecstatic. But now it's, can you do 2 in a day? Can you do 2 in an hour? And that has changed how we've got to do that risk. And so it could be layers. It could be that pipeline itself, managing the risk of a pipeline, certainly if you're doing continuous delivery, might be more important. And that covers certain risks. So actually, your pipeline mitigates these risks. Then your sprint team needs to mitigate these risks of a feature level and so on. So you can kind of like align risks to different activities or parts. Not so it's invisible, just so you know what bit's responsible for what risk. So your pipeline can do the rollbacks, so you know you've got a process in place. Like we do disaster recovery. That's a big risk for the whole project, but we test that every 6 months, not every tiny change. So you kind of almost create like risk cycles and risk feedback loops for the different types of risk at different paces. I don't know. It's a complicated idea, but there's probably more refinement needed to it to figure out how it would work.
Makes total sense to me. I'm not saying we should do risk management or risk analysis on an add to cart button or something, or a label or something, which we add within minutes, as you said. But
it adds up, doesn't it? If you do that, then the next little thing, then you've created 15 little things. That's one thing.
Exactly. And that's why we're being paid good money. as quality people to figure out what is the right level to do risk analysis on. Is that on the pipeline? Is that on the new feature that we're going to cut up into many little small releases, but it's still a feature? Well, we hide it behind a feature toggle for a couple of months, but we release it every minute. Yeah, that might be an interesting thing to do risk analysis on. And personally, the way I look at it is, if you haven't thought about risk or communicated about risk or did this in a way where you're honestly very happy about, where you completely understand risk, if you haven't done that and you're doing testing on a user story or writing test automation, you're probably doing the wrong thing. Personally, having a risk discussion with your team and figuring out what your job should be as a testing person or a quality person is the single best thing that you can do. Not only will you figure out what you should be doing as a job, what you're being paid for, but the people around you will also understand, and they can help you, and they can guide you, and they can support you, and you can guide and support them through that discussion or the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. I remember as a baby tester, there was a lot of pressure to say, everything's fine. We've got green tests. But that's not necessarily providing good software. And, if you make the test match the condition of the application, not necessarily making the test match the requirement or the mitigation of risk that you want to embody in it, then it's not necessarily, you're not doing yourself any favors, you're not doing the software any favors, and you're not doing the organization any favors. And I would say, a lot of that pressure was pressure I was putting on myself because of my personality. But, other organizations, other individuals may feel it from their organization. It does happen. But yeah, finding your way and definitely having those discussions about risk and mitigation is a way forward. And if you have them, people will appreciate it. And as you say, Beren, your colleagues will start to have your back.
And I think on that note, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Beren, for being our guest tonight and coming up with that idea. Thank you also, Dermot, for your insight into that. And it's been a really interesting discussion tonight. And I'm sure that we will be coming back to this particular topic at a later stage in the podcast. Obviously, I'll thank Russell as well for his input as well, because so thank you very much for listening. Please do reach out to us with your comments about the topic we've discussed today about risk. You can reach out to us on email, contact us at testingpeers.com. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We also have Patreon, where you can add us there and donate to keep us available. And thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for the guests. Thank you again for Saffron QA, and we'll welcome you back in a couple of weeks' time.
For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.